sisters and brothers, we're so excited to welcome our next guests, our next organizers, speakers who've been fighting for liberation, fighting against U.S. occupation abroad. Our next speakers from Code Pink, please welcome Medea Benjamin.
It's nice to be here with a crowd that understands our role in this moment right now, when we are seeing the attempts by our government to overthrow another elected government in what is obviously a coup. And it's impossible to call this by any other name than a coup. So say no coup in Venezuela. No coup in Venezuela. No coup in Venezuela. No coup in Venezuela. So I am with the group Code Pink and my co-director here, Jody Evans. We were in Venezuela several times. We saw with our own eyes what was happening during the time of the Bolivarian Revolution, when there were so many gains for the poor and the working class. We saw how Chavez was giving out land to the indigenous people that was rightly theirs, and finally they were given the legal title to that land. We saw how people who never had a chance to get an education, and certainly not a college education, were for the first times in their lives given access to college education for free, something we don't have in this country. We saw with our own eyes how the Cuban doctors and nurses were fanning out across the rural areas of Venezuela that had never had doctors and nurses before, that had never had access to free, good health care, something we don't have in the United States of America. We also saw something else, which was that the spirit of the Bolivarian Revolution was spreading all over Latin America. We saw it with governments that were progressive, people-centered governments, going all the way from Brazil and Argentina through Central America. And we saw how Venezuela was championing a relationship with those countries through something called ALBA. Raise your hand if you've heard of ALBA. So some of you have, and others of you haven't. ALBA was a solidarity kind of economic relationship between countries of Latin America that were not gearing their economies towards corporate profits, but were gearing their economies towards how do they help the people. And it was a beautiful thing to see how the resources of different countries were going to help the poorest countries of Latin America. And this is something that the U.S. could not tolerate. This is something that the U.S. said, it's bad enough to see a redistribution of resources in Venezuela, but we can't allow the resources to be spread around Latin America, because the model of a socialist system that worked is something that the U.S. was always against, which is why they tried the coup in 2002, and it's why they're trying the coup as we speak today. It is why they took somebody who was never elected president by one person in Venezuela, Juan Guaido, and said, this guy is going to be the president. And they're saying that this is somehow democratic as against the 6 million people who voted for Maduro. And it's why when they declared Juan Guaido and a bunch of their puppets here in Washington, D.C., that we got up in front of their press conferences to say these people have absolutely no legitimacy.
Right.
Well, that didn't work. So a month later, they tried using humanitarian aid as a weapon of war, and that didn't work either. And now they were gloating about a blackout in Venezuela that has jeopardized the lives of so many people, and you see people like Marco Rubio acting as if that was a wonderful thing because it was going to bring down the government. There is nobody in that White House or in this administration that cares at all for the Venezuelan people. That has been so clear by the sanctions that they have introduced that are designed precisely to strangle the economy and designed to make life miserable for the Venezuelan people. But we are here to say that we are absolutely against economic sanctions, that we are absolutely against the economic warfare this government is waging on Venezuela, and we are absolutely opposed to any type of U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. There is a bill in Congress right now that it's important for us to support, introduced by Congressman David Cicilline, that says no to an unauthorized U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. It's called H.R. 1004. It now has 53 co-sponsors of it, and given the representatives we have in Congress, that's actually pretty good. But we need that to grow. So all of you, when you go home, one thing you can certainly do is get your congressperson to support H.R. 1004, no military intervention in Venezuela. So on behalf of Code Pink, on behalf of women throughout this country that are trying to end the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, on behalf of all peace-loving people in this country, including this beautiful crowd here, we say we will do everything possible to stop our country from waging this war on Venezuela. And we say, as we've been saying all these months, hands off Venezuela, hands off Venezuela, hands off Venezuela, hands off Venezuela, hands off Venezuela. Thank you.
¡Fuera Venezuela, golpista gringo! Next, I'd like to bring up the National Coordinator of the Answer Coalition, Brian Becker.
I want to say very briefly that the purpose of this mobilization is not simply to have a one-time event, but to inaugurate a nationwide movement that can say that the United States government, whether it's Trump or the equally imperialist Democrats, have no right, no capacity, no competence to tell the people of Venezuela who their president is and what their government should look like. Only Venezuela can determine the destiny of Venezuela. I stood here almost to this day, 16 years ago, 3 years before the Bush administration invaded Iraq. That was 16 years ago, almost to the day. What preceded the war against Iraq, a war that took 1 million lives, what preceded it was the widespread demonization of the Iraqi government to prepare the population for the next aggression. That's right. When we stand here today, what do we see in common between what happened 16 years ago, today, and today? Iraq had the second largest reserve of oil in the Middle East, and Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil in the world. This is not about human rights. It's not about democracy. It's not about anything other than the control of Venezuela's oil and resources. Will it be for Venezuelans, for the poor, for the working population, or will it be for ExxonMobil and Goldman Sachs? That's what the issue is.
Sisters and brothers, I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker, Sierra Taylor from the Popular Education Project.
Thank you all so much for being here.
be free from the imperial rule of the United States.
That's right.
We know that Venezuela is no threat to us.
It isn't.
It is simply an example of what people can do when they decide their destiny as a nation-building, a revolutionary project.
That's right.
I recently got back from Venezuela, and what I experienced in my 2 weeks there truly astonished me. While the racist, capitalist class declared a humanitarian crisis, all I could think about is the real humanitarian crisis faced by our people in the United States. I did not even see homeless people in Venezuela. Meanwhile, in the United States, homelessness is growing by leaps and bounds. Today, there are more than 64 million people working for less than $15 an hour, while the top 1% of our country owns more than doubled of 20% of our national income. 13.8 million households in this country face unaffordable water bills, and at least 4 million families with children are being exposed to high levels of lead from drinking water and other sources. Thousands have died every year because some states' decisions to deny Medicaid expansion. More than 250,000 people in the United States die each year from poverty-related causes. We are here to denounce the hypocrisy of the United States government. We are here to say that we will not be complicit in the brutality of this imperialist war machine. There will not be another Iraq. We will not allow for the tentacles of capitalism and imperialism and its systems of oppression to invade, rape, pillage, and exploit. We will not stand by while the U.S. government strangles the economy of the Venezuelan people and steals $7 billion a year to cause civil unrest in Venezuela as a result of basic resources resulting from economic sanctions. Today we stand in solidarity with Venezuela and its Bolivarian revolution. Today we defend the people's right to decide their own destiny without any type of U.S. intervention. Venezuela is an example of the power that we have when we align ourselves with the poor and dispossessed over greed and consumption for the sake of the collective future of our society, our precious earth, and our very souls. The same hell that marginalized and poor communities with the United States borders is catching the same hell in the West with the support of the spineless corporate media and a weaponized Silicon Valley that's doling it out to countries around the world. The devastation witnessed in countries like Iraq, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Puerto Rico, whose only real crime is being rich in natural resources, are reasons why we must say hands off Venezuela. In the building and sustaining of the workers' political project in Venezuela, they have ensured free education at all levels of engagement of the formal education process. At the university level, they have access to free public education, daily transportation from even the most rural areas, textbooks, and free food. They have enacted free health care, supplemental income for mothers and families, low-income housing that have allowed families to stay in their communities, and have access to housing in the city at national, state, and local levels with community-based cooperatives. Thank you so much.
Next, I want to bring up someone who I've had the privilege in being in struggle with, Imam Mahdi Bray, the Executive Director of the American Muslim Alliance. Please give it up for Imam Mahdi Bray.
We need peace. Let me say, my brothers and sisters, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we say to our brothers and sisters in New Zealand, to Venezuela, we're standing for justice today. We're standing for justice today. You know, I remember Martin Luther King when he used to say that, you know, he used to teach the teaching of a Palestinian activist from Nazareth. He said, blessed are the peacemaker. He didn't say, blessed are the military-industrial complex. He didn't say, blessed are the war criminals. He didn't say, blessed are those who want to run
you're thinking the same thing I am, which is that considering the gang that has taken over the White House, anything is possible. I remember when President Trump ran promising to end regime change wars and correctly saying that the war in Iraq was a mistake. And then he turned around and filled the White House up with individuals like John Bolton and Elliot Abrams. People, yeah, you can let them know how we feel. People who have been overthrowing governments and destroying countries for decades. He couldn't even come up with anybody new to do it. And this has created a situation of terror in Venezuela. I can tell you, I was just there. And I spoke with many people who are horrified, actually afraid, that they could soon face a U.S. military intervention. I spoke with one friend, a fellow journalist, who actually broke down crying to me. She said, we watched the United States destroy Libya. We watched the United States destroy Syria. And I never thought that I would be afraid of the same scenario playing out in my country. That's the level of psychological warfare the United States is already waging on the people there. It's terrifying. We had that conversation about 2 days before the United States did attempt to invade Venezuela. We shouldn't be afraid to say that's what happened on February 23rd when the U.S. orchestrated a media circus on the border with Colombia with its trucks of humanitarian aid, hoping to create the pretext for further military intervention. It didn't happen because Venezuela was prepared to fight. Venezuela withstood, resisted, and attempted U.S. military intervention. Yes. And that's why we're all here to say that we don't want to see any future attempts at that, but we need to recognize that the war on Venezuela is already being waged. It's been waged for years. I don't believe we're going to see, and maybe I'm hopeful, I don't believe we're going to see an Iraq-style invasion happen again, not in Venezuela or anywhere else. Instead, we've entered this new phase of 21st century warfare where the battlefield is in the media and the economy. The United States is waging a war on Venezuela through international capital and finance. I witnessed the effects of this firsthand while I was in Venezuela. We're told that there's a humanitarian crisis. I was in Gaza last year. I saw what a humanitarian crisis looks like, one that is actually enabled by the same government which claims to care about Venezuelans. What I saw in Venezuela was nothing like what I saw in Gaza. However, there is an economic crisis, and that's a direct result, the intentional result of U.S. policy. Yeah. So, one final thing I just want to say is that when I was at rallies with the opposition, the people who are now showing up here to try and shut us down, when I was with them in Caracas, they all admitted that their demonstrations were much smaller and weaker than they'd been in years past. But they also all told me that they were confident this time they would see a change in regime. And when I asked them why, it was because they would say, because of Donald Trump and because the United States is backing us in a way they never have before. That told me two things. Juan Guaido will only ride into power in Caracas on the back of a U.S. tank. And the Venezuelan opposition's confidence doesn't come from the streets of Caracas, it comes from the streets of Washington, D.C. But they must have been confused, they must have been thinking about the elites, because I'm looking at the streets right now and I see people who say no war in Venezuela. We need humanitarian aid here in a country where over 40 million people live in poverty before we start worrying about Venezuela. But we need to be clear. The war on Venezuela has already begun. We need to say, stop the sanctions, end the financial terrorism, and keep our hands off Venezuela. Right, hands off. Please welcome Roberto Villarroel Quesada and Basilio Buendía from el Movimiento al Socialismo Más y PSP from Bolivia.
Ahora se llaman los países neoliberales que hoy están matando de hambre a todo Argentina, Brasil, Ecuador, Lima y todos los países que con administraciones neoliberales no asumen una responsabilidad social.
Now these neoliberals are organizing against Latin America. They're organizing against Argentina. They're organizing against Brazil. In South America. And we have to say no.
Aquí están los originarios e indígenas dándoles superioridad, gobernando a todos los países neoliberales para poder sacar adelante todos los pueblos del mundo.
Here we are, indigenous people, showing that we can govern, showing the rest of the world, putting the world to shame, and governing our own country.
Next, I want to bring all the way from Boston, Teresa, who's an activist there, working with the Ultra Coalition, and who's also a Venezuelan. Welcome, Teresa.
Even through the conditions of crippling sanctions and economic war since the Obama administration, the people continue to build and organize. So we stand here today in solidarity with the Venezuelan people that continue to fight for that same independent and sovereign nation that Simón Bolívar wanted us to have. La Revolución Bolivariana has historically stood strongly and unapologetically in solidarity with the oppressed people of the global south and the entire continent of Aviala. The resistance we see today and every day from the Venezuelan people against imperialism and world oppression is one that continues to inspire the oppressed nations everywhere. Chavez always stood in solidarity with the Palestinians, the people of Puerto Rico, Haiti, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and many more. We must continuously speak up against attempts from the U.S. to overthrow leftist governments across the global south, alongside building revolutionary power that aims to build a world without war and exploitation. ¡Que viva Venezuela! ¡Que viva la Revolución Bolivariana! ¡Y que vivan los pueblos luchadores y trabajadores del mundo! ¡Hoy y siempre! Gracias.
Now next I want to bring up the national coordinator of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, Sister Taliba Abuya.
I bring greetings on behalf of the New African People's Organization and the Malcolm X grassroots movement. I honor the legacy and the resistance of my ancestors and the revolutionary spirit of the New African Independence movement. I am Taliba Abuya. The self-determination of Venezuela is directly tied to the liberation of the black nation in this U.S. empire, and we must stand with them. In 2018, the New African People's Organization and the Malcolm X grassroots movement stood in solidarity with the Venezuelan people and observed as they prepared to elect their president. We observed the elections in Venezuela, which resulted in the election of President Nicolas Maduro and the Bolivian Revolution. With heart and mind, we condemn the assault of the sovereignty of the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela by the Trump-Pence regime and their allies and satellite states in the region. The Venezuelan masses continue to support the Bolivian Revolution in spite of these U.S.-imposed sanctions and economic destabilization. The revolution has made significant impact on the lives and the social well-beings of the working and poor Venezuelans. The revolution has committed the resources of the country to benefit the working masses and the poor, created space for women, indigenous, and African descendants to voice and express their rights and achieve economic and cultural development. In the spirit of Hugo Chavez, the Bolivian Revolution has also promoted international solidarity in the region and oppressed people in other nations around the globe. Hands off Venezuela! Hands off Venezuela!
Please welcome Heather Benner of the Answer Coalition. Woo!
Thank you, sisters, and thank you to all of you for being out here today. As Karina said, my name is Heather. I'm with the Answer Coalition. I'm an Iraqi-American anti-imperialist activist right here in Washington, D.C. And I know each and every one of you are anti-imperialists too, or else you wouldn't be out here today saying, hands off Venezuela, no more coup, no more sanctions, and no war. We know in the Answer Coalition that the war against working people right here in the United States, the war against the caravan of immigrants coming up from Honduras, El Salvador, across Central America, the war against our brothers and sisters, teachers who are losing their jobs and benefits. This is the same war that we're fighting against intervention in Venezuela. When the U.S. government froze the assets of the Venezuelan people, this is not a new form of theft, but it's a continued form of theft. It's like stealing from the poorest, the most in need Venezuelans who rely on government support. So we're here today saying that we're going to build this movement without corporate support. Unlike the right-wingers, we don't have the corporate media behind us.
Next, I want to bring up Jill Chun of the 21st Century Institute.
Hands up! Do you believe that this neocon gangster regime in DC will win in their regime change in Venezuela? Do you believe? No! Who will win then? People of Venezuela, people of the world will win, not the Washington regime. This is the 500 years evermore same, the gangster imperialist power of the world. People will win. People of Venezuela will win. Hands up!
Sisters and brothers, I want you to please give a warm welcome our next speaker. We're so honored to have today a longtime activist and leader with the Black Alliance for Peace. Please make some noise for Nefa Freeman.
Greetings, sisters and brothers. I'm actually here to give a statement on behalf of our brother Jamo Baraka, the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace, who can't be here today because he's trapped in Venezuela. He went there on a delegation, and, well, you'll hear about what happened in the statement. So on behalf of Jamo Baraka, comrades, brothers and sisters, I bring you revolutionary greetings from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on this day of struggle and resistance as we collectively call for all power to the people. I wish that I could have been there physically today, but in a cowardly act of imperialist intrigue, the pilots of American Airlines joined the U.S. State Department in its efforts to create the impression of crisis in Venezuela. And so now members of our peace delegation have been forced to seek alternative paths back to the U.S. that will take literally days. But the story today is not about us, it's about you gathered in the fundamental solidarity with the struggling people of Venezuela. With your presence, you have struck a blow against the myth that all sectors of the population support the mad plans of Trump and its supporters in the Democratic Party. With your presence today, it will be a reminder to the people of Venezuela, who we made aware of today's event, that you are standing with them. With your presence, you say to the world that there are people in this country, this plantation, that understand their historic task to resist from the belly of the beast the bloodthirsty plans of the predatory colonial imperialist U.S., European Union, NATO axis of domination. Over the course of the last few days, our delegation has seen much, but we did not see a crisis in the government of Venezuela. The crisis that we did see in Venezuela is not the crisis of socialism or the Bolivarian process. What we saw was the crisis of imperialism, an imperialism unable to conquer and humiliate and degrade the proud people of Venezuela. Please continue to support Black Alliance for Peace program to shut down AFRICOM and our upcoming campaign that will launch April 4th, highlighting the link between U.S. militarism abroad and the war being waged against black and brown people and working class domestically. We say at the Black Alliance for Peace, not one drop of blood of black and brown people and the working class to defend the interests of capitalist dictatorship. Make the issue of war and U.S. imperialism the litmus test for who is really a progressive in the United States. Stand for justice, fight for peace, victory until death. Ajamo Baraka, Caracas, Venezuela.
Thank you to the Black Alliance for Peace and solidarity with all those like Ajamo who have been stuck there. Next, I want to bring up a true frontline struggler for the rights of working class and oppressed people, one of our best popular leaders here in the District of Columbia as well, the Reverend Graylin Hagler, Senior Minister at Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ.
I'm glad that you're out here, because one thing that is important when folks talk about those of us who are radically progressive, the fact is that we continue to speak to the issues not in a sentimental fashion, but in a historical context, for we understand what imperialism looks like in the context of history and what it's always meant. So we don't engage in the sentimentality that often folks want to lead us into, like the press talking about the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Well, how did the humanitarian crisis become the humanitarian crisis? And who do you expect to fix the humanitarian crisis? That's like, from my theological tradition, inviting the devil in to fix your sin. We stand here as people of conscience and understanding because we were out around to try to stop an invasion of Iraq. We were right then, and we're right now. We stood up years before that around intervention around the Contras, if y'all remember that. And crack cocaine flooded the black community in order to fund the Contras to carry out an illegal war. We were right in opposing it then. We're right today. We're right today in opposing any intervention in Venezuela whatsoever. You can't fix it because you broke it. The United States of America broke it. Ever since, particularly in modern time, Hugo Chavez, America understood that it was a struggle between the poor and the rich, the black and the brown and the white. There is a racial dynamic all around the world, and we need to wake up to it and call it for what it is. That has always been racism, that has fueled imperialism. It has always been racism that has fueled the oppression all through South America, all through Central America, even in the Caribbean, and even in Africa. We say no to war. Get your hands off Venezuela. God bless you.
Hey, from the International Action Center, please welcome Taryn and Lowe. What are people here willing to do to stop this war on Venezuela? What are people going to be willing to sacrifice? What are people going to be willing to unite around in order to end U.S. imperialism? Lone, tell them.
We remember Vietnam, we remember Libya, we remember Syria, we remember Yemen. We know what is happening in Venezuela right now. Democracy under capitalism is democracy for the rich. It is democracy for killer cops. It is democracy for Jeff Bezos, for Donald Trump, for the Bolsonaros of the world. It is not democracy for working people. It is not democracy for black people. It is not democracy for women, for queer people, for trans people. So what do we have to do? We have to start with the struggle here. We have to fight to unite the workers and the oppressed here, because death to imperialism starts in the heart of the empire. And if that means that we have to go down with it, so be it. Occupy the banks, occupy the White House,
occupy the streets. This is a life or death struggle. And the global revolutionary class struggle is the only hope for humanity. So we have to fight, and we have to start now. And the revolutionary left has to be a united fist.
Next, I want to bring up someone who also, you may have seen, was helping to bust a lot of the lies in the past, even few weeks, that we're hearing in the United States over and over and over again about Venezuela. I want to welcome to the microphone Max Blumenthal, the editor of GrayZone.com, recently back from the Venezuela on the ground.
Thank you, Max Blumenthal.
What a beautiful crowd. Thank you. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Answer, Code Pink, everybody who showed up to represent. And thank you to those cats. Just take a look at the puppet factory over there. What a bunch of puppets. I haven't seen so many puppets since I was a kid and I watched Sesame Street. I wish Jim Henson was here today. Oh my God. I mean, can you imagine showing up in front of the White House to ask them to invade your country? That's what they have been reduced to, and I'm going to talk about why. Because I went to Venezuela with my team at the Gray Zone, Aaron Mate, Ben Norton, Anya Parampil, to break the media blockade, to break this monotonous narrative that's drumming up a humanitarian intervention. And we saw something totally different than they were showing you on every network, including Fox News, who's here today. Thank you. Hey, at least they're here. Where is the CIA News Network? I mean, CNN. Where are they at? Where's Rachel Maddow? She's talking about, like, Russia hacking the weather. Okay, so at least Fox is here, okay? What we saw, among many things that are very different from as being portrayed, is a reality show coup fall apart before our very eyes. Raise your hand if before January 2nd you'd heard of Juan Guaido. I don't see a lot of hands. And that means you're like a lot of Venezuelans who had never heard of him, and you're like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who referred to him as Juan Guaido when he first talked about him. Like, hey, I'm Juan Guaido. Hey, let's do a coup in my country, bada boom, bada bing. No, it wasn't like that, Pompeo. What we saw when we were there on February 23rd was the U.S. attempt to ram through humanitarian aid on trucks, and the riot squad of Guarimbas actually burned the U.S. aid, and little Marco Rubio, who was on the Colombian border at 3 a.m. with very busy thumbs at 3 a.m. on the Colombian border, like the final scene of Scarface, little Marco blamed the Maduro government for burning those trucks. And what we showed at the Gray Zone, along with brave Venezuelan reporters, including our friends from Telesur, is the lie that they tried to deploy to escalate a conflict and spark an intervention. And what we also saw walking through the barrios, like 23 Enero, like walking through Comuna Panal, walking through the communities of Caracas, was the conscience of the Venezuelan people who are mobilizing on a popular level against this coup. It's because of them and because of their conscience that this coup has failed. It's not because of some dictator in his bat cave with some computers. It's because of the conscience of the Venezuelan people that they stood up during an electrical blackout that was designed to destabilize their society, and they pulled together and they helped each other find water, and they helped each other charge their phones, and they came together as a community to stand up against the most powerful empire in history and the worst economic war we've seen directed against another country, and they have emerged victorious. They control the streets of Venezuela, and that's why this puppet factory is in front of the White House to beg for US F-16s to give them democracy in the form of IMF loans and human rights in the form of another Libya, another Syria, another Iraq. It ain't gonna happen. So we have a role here. I know I'm supposed to have 2 minutes, but I love the sound of my voice. I'm sorry. Our role here is to be the conscience of our own society when some of our socialist politicians are not standing up and saying very clearly, hands off Venezuela, and they're kind of playing both sides. It's our role to be that conscience. It's our role role and our responsibility to protect the Venezuelan people when sociopaths in the White House are calling for a war under the auspices of responsibility to protect. It's our role to show that we command the streets, not the elites. It's our role to show that these are our streets and that we need humanitarian aid in our streets. Whose streets? Whose streets? Whose streets? Hands off! Thank you.
I want to bring up Lee Camp to say a few words for us.
And by the way, ask these people which country it is that U.S. has screwed with, has fucked with, that they want Venezuela to end up like. Do they want it to be Syria? Do they want it to be Libya? Do they want it to be Iraq? Is that what they want? The U.S. has not done any good for those countries that we have upended, okay? And furthermore, the fake facade of the reasons that we want to go in and upend Venezuela and create our U.S.-backed coup, it's all fallen away. The fake reasons are gone. So now you have John Bolton saying on Fox News that it's for the oil, all right? It's for the oil, it's for the power. It's not even, they can't even cover it up anymore. Like, they don't even know how to fake it. Like, for God's sakes, become better liars.
Thank you, Lee. Redacted tonight. That's his show. I forgot to say it. Watch it every day.
Whose streets? Whose streets? Sisters and brothers, our last speaker is the physical representation of that saying. This woman has dedicated her entire life for fighting not just against U.S. wars abroad, but for fighting for people here, fighting for jobs, fighting for education, fighting for immigrant rights. Gloria La Riva from the Cuba Venezuela Solidarity Committee. Let's put your hands together, please, for Gloria La Riva. Sisters and brothers, it's a great day today because we and people around the world are marching for Venezuela. I had the great privilege to be there during the blackout that took place. I was due to fly out at 7 p.m. Thursday. I was at the airport and the lights went out at 5. And I thought something happened at the airport. But within an hour, it was clear it was the whole country. And it was shocking because we knew that we're in the middle of this aggression by the United States and wondered what's going to happen. Is there going to be bombing? Is there going to be troops? Is something else going to happen? What's going to happen to President Maduro? We spent the night wondering. And then just like the sun comes up every day, the people came out. It was a normal day. They went and did their work. It was not easy because they couldn't buy on their debit card the food that they needed. It wasn't easy because you had no communications. I took a moto taxi at 7 a.m. to the presidential palace because I figured there might be electricity there. And there was emergency power. And found out that it wasn't sabotage. This is what happened. And it kept happening. These heroic workers kept bringing back the power. And then it would fall another hour. And back up again. And today, I heard from my friend in Venezuela because someone told me, a reporter said they heard that there's still a blackout there. He said, no, the power is restored, but the terrorists bombed an electrical plant in a middle-class neighborhood. Terrorism. And in fact, there was a press conference by Desi Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, together with the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in Moscow, because Venezuela announced that their oil offices in Europe are moving to Moscow. They have to protect themselves. And Lavrov said the U.S. is buying weapons and shipping them to Venezuela, to Brazil, and to Colombia. What they plan is partly a paramilitary war. The danger is on. When I was at the bridge of Tienditas on February 23rd with hundreds of young people ready to fight and defend their country, Freddy Bernal, the chief protector of Táchira State, because it's a dangerous area, he told the people,
right.
Thank you, Gloria. Are you ready to march?
The triumph of capital over labor. The triumph